Hello everybody, I hope that you are doing well. As you have probably noticed, springtime is well underway at this point. Flowers are coming out, leaves are coming out, animals are coming out, the sun is getting warmer. It feels like the earth is waking up from a long, cold, and deep sleep. Even though this winter wasn't as cold or snowy as other winters, it's still refreshing to have all of the life start to spring up around us. And it's very fitting for happening to be around Easter time. You know, Jesus came back from the dead, life from the dead, and that's what springtime reminds us of as well. So, what I wanted to talk about this week, and I thought it would be a very fitting week because of all of the blossoms everywhere, is talking about pollination and springtime flowers. So this is a topic that we did talk about back in fall in our study of plants. So back in the fall we talked about pollination and why it was important. But now that there are so many flowers around and we can see it with our own eyes much easier, I thought it'd be appropriate to revisit that idea and maybe teach you a few new things about that as well. So first off, let's start by looking inside a flower. If you remember, there's different structures inside a flower that make pollen and different structures that take pollen. So the reason pollen is important for flowers is flowers need pollen from another flower in order to make seeds. So say we have two flowers of the same type, let's say dandelions. Dandelion number 2 needs to get pollen from dandelion number 1, otherwise it can't make seeds very well. And obviously plants want to make seeds so that they can make more plants. If they can't make more plants, then the plant would die out. So pollination, that is getting pollen from one flower to another flower, is a very important process, and we like to talk about it a lot in science. So inside the flower, these 6 football-looking structures in this particular flower, they look like footballs on the end of a stick. These are called the stamen, and they are what make pollen. So remember, lots of flowers like to make pollen, and they also like to take pollen. So they need to give it to another flower, but they also need to take pollen from other flowers as well. Now this yellow thing in the middle of the flower, that is called the pistil. And that is very kind of sticky, and the pollen, if pollen touches that, it'll stick to that. Remember, the flower needs to get pollen from another flower in order to make seeds. So the whole idea of pollination is getting pollen from these little football structures, the stamen of the one flower, to the pistil of another flower, and then it can make seeds. So this is called pollination. So the question is, how do we get pollen from one flower to another? Because flowers don't really move very well. They can't walk over and dump some pollen in another flower. So we have to find a different way for them to pollinate. So if you see here, on the bottom left corner of your screen, there is a flower, and it has, I put 3 little pollen grains in right there, the little yellow circles. And we need to get those pollen grains over to the other flower on the bottom right-hand side. Now, the first way that some plants pollinate is with wind. So, and the pollen is loose enough in the one flower that can just blow out of that flower, and it's kind of like a dust in the air then, and it might happen to land on the other flower. And so I have a little animation here to show you that. So the wind's going to come by and pick up the pollen, and it's going to land on the other flower, hopefully. And if it does, then the flowers have successfully pollinated, and that second flower can go ahead and start making seeds. But that's not the only way that plants pollinate. That's one way that many plants pollinate, but other plants use what are called pollinators. And one of the most famous pollinators out there is the honeybee. So this lovely little fuzzy guy is a honeybee. And he is a very, very important creature for a lot of the world's plants. A lot of our crops that we rely on for food, and lots of just other plants like flowers in our garden, and some trees rely on bees to pollinate them. And so without bees, they would not have as many pollinators to move the pollen from one plant to another. Now, notice on this bee a couple things. First off, notice how fuzzy he is. Pollen is kind of like a dust, and if you've ever taken a fuzzy sweatshirt and put it in dirt, you notice that the dirt sticks to it really well. So because this bee is nice and fuzzy, the pollen's going to stick to him pretty well. And notice also on his back left leg right here, we can see a big clump of pollen that's kind of got it all clumped together right there. Lots of times you'll see these clumps of pollen on bees where it gets stuck and it doesn't really come off of them. So there's a lot of pollen right there on that bee. But anyways, so to answer our question of how pollen gets from one flower to another, the first answer was wind, and another answer is pollinators. They are the creatures that move pollen from one plant to another. Now the thing is, the flower has to find a good reason to get the bee to come to it. Like why would the bee want to come visit a flower? He's got better things to do, doesn't he? But there's something in it for the bee as well. So when a bee comes and visits a flower, the bee actually ends up drinking some very sweet, sugary water that's down in the bottom of the flower called nectar. And so the flower is actually a source of food for the bee. So by being brightly colored and by smelling nice, the flower can tell the bee, hey, there's some good food here. Come and have a nice meal. And the bee comes and has a nice meal and says yummy because it's a delicious, sugary meal. And then the bee flies away. But notice when the bee flies away, that pollen got stuck to the side of that fuzzy bee. So when the bee flies away and goes to the next flower and has a nice meal, he's going to move some of that pollen from the first flower to the other. And he doesn't even have to think about doing it. It just kind of sticks to him and it works out. So when he flies away, some of that pollen gets left behind, and that flower has been pollinated and it can now start making seeds. So isn't pollination wonderful? God made such a good world where even flowers and bees rely on each other and they work together in order to survive. So they both survive by this. The flowers are able to make seeds and the bees are able to eat. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about some special kinds of flowers that you might not think about all the time. So these are going to be flowers all that come on trees. Interestingly enough, flowers don't only show up like on the ground in your grass, but they also are on trees. So right here is a cherry flower, and if you have any cherry trees around, you probably can see very, very beautiful white, purple, or pink blossoms coming from it right now. And it looks a lot like what we expect a flower to look like. You see the petals, and you see the stamen and pistil and everything in there. It's a very normal flower. Let's look at some other trees and see how they make flowers. Because any tree that makes seeds is going to need to pollinate in some way. And so most are going to have a flower or something flower-like. So let's look at a maple tree. You don't normally think of maple trees as being beautiful blossoming trees, but they do have flowers still. So I'm going to look close up at, I think this is a red maple tree. You can actually see right all these little buds. Notice those little things sticking out? Those are going to be your stamen and pistil coming out of there. And each of those little ones is a flower. So maples actually have lots of little flowers along their branches right before their leaves come out here. So the leaves will kind of come out and kind of cover it up then, but they do have little flowers that last for a little while in the springtime. Now, another tree, and this one you might think of even less of as having flower, is the oak tree. But oak trees actually do have flowers as well. So I have a big oak tree in my front yard, which is what made me think of this. Now they have a very special kind of flower I thought you might enjoy learning about. See those little strands hanging down? They almost look like a little kitten tail or something coming down. They look kind of fuzzy maybe. Those are the flowers of the oak tree. And there are a lot of trees that have flowers that look like this, and they get a special name, and those names are catkins. And notice it's very appropriate because it kind of reminds you of like a cat's tail, like I said earlier. And some of them are actually very fuzzy like a cat as well. So it actually does come from a word, I think from German, that means kitten. So the catkins are the flowers that oak trees use. And what's interesting about this is that these actually pollinate by wind. So because the trees are up they have their flowers way up high in the air, the wind blows by and it blows the pollen out, and it lands on a different catkin than the pollen started on. And then the oak tree can take that and make acorns. And so that's the seed that the oak tree makes using the pollen. So that's just a fun fact for you there. Alright, so I want to show you one more kind of tree and show you its flowers as well. First, here's a close-up picture of a catkin. This looks like it's more from a birch tree or something. There's different kinds of trees that use catkins, but they look like little kitten tails hanging down. But anyways, the next type of flower you're going to learn about is a pine tree flower. Now, I need to be scientifically accurate and say this is not technically a flower, but it's sort of like a flower. It's kind of in the place of a flower on a pine tree. And those look like baby cones, and that actually is what they are. So pine trees actually have cones, and that's how they make pollen and how they make seeds. So most pine trees actually have two kinds of cones, one that makes pollen and one that makes seeds. And when the wind blows past a pine tree that has lots of pollen cones on it, you actually see what looks like a yellow cloud come out of the tree. And I have a picture of that here for you. So maybe this spring, if you happen to be out and you find some pine trees that have pollen cones on them, what you could do is you could maybe tap the branch and you'll see this big cloud of yellow dust move out. And of course, if you're allergic to pollen, don't do this because it can make you very sneezy and sniffly and red-eyed. But I've had fun making big pollen clouds before with pine trees. And then that pollen gets blown in the wind and lands on another kind of cone that takes the pollen and makes seeds. And that's what we know as pine cones. So in the pine cones, if you break them open, you can sometimes find little seeds in there, and those are pine tree seeds. Anyways, I thought you would just enjoy learning about those new types of flowers or flower-like things in trees, because we don't think of trees as having flowers, but they need to pollinate just as much as any other plant. So I hope that you can enjoy looking for catkins and looking for cones outside if you get a chance to go outside by some trees. Or if nothing else, enjoy watching a little bumblebee buzzing about his business. Alright, take care.